after the paralogisms and the antinomy, Kant now brings us to the ideal of pure reason, the third and last of the three major parts of the dialectic, in which Kant is now going to talk about the concept of God. Now, when it came to the paralogisms and our conception of the self and the antinomy and our conception of the world, in a sense, it is clear how reason, even a reason like ours, that is in some sense limited to experience, to sensible experience, how that kind of reason could come up with these ideas. Because when we have experience, well, there is a self experiencing something in the world, and so self and world are kind of like the two poles of any kind of experience. So if we search for the sort of unconditioned in the self or the unconditioned in the world, then we come up with the paralogisms and the antinomy and get into all these problems that are inherent in human reason. But how does human reason ever get to the concept of God? Right? That seems to be a bit problematic. It doesn't immediately seem to follow from the basic starting point of the critical philosophy. And if that were the case, right, if there were no story about why human beings ever come up with the concept of God, then Kant might be in a bit of trouble. Because that would seem to give at least some plausibility to the Cartesian argument, the argument of Descartes, the Cartesian argument, that there is something very special about the fact that we even have the idea of a God. Right? In the Meditations, Descartes finds that he himself has the idea of a God, and then he argues that he could only have gotten the idea of a God from God himself. And that is going to be sort of part of the, or really the essential step in the first proof that Descartes gives of the existence of God. That is not the story that Kant wants to tell. Right? Kant wants to tell a story where the idea of God somehow follows from the way that human reason itself works. So something about our relation, our cognitive relation to the world, to experience, should bring us towards something like the conception of God. And that is what Kant is going to talk about in the first two sections of the ideal of pure reason, which is what this video is about. Like, the more famous sections are his criticisms of the proofs of the existence of God, especially his criticism of the ontological argument. But actually a lot of interesting things are happening in this section too, and it will be very important for us to pay close attention to it. Okay, but let's start with section 1. The ideal in general. Right? This is a new term. We had been talking about the ideas of reason, but now Kant is going to talk about the ideal of reason. What is an ideal? Well, Kant tells us at A568, I call the ideal by which I understand the idea not merely in concreto, but in individuo, that is, as an individual thing which is determinable or even determined through the idea alone. Right, the idea is in some sense, well, it's an idea, it's something mental, right? It's a concept. Maybe not a concept in the strictest sense, but something like a concept. An ideal is an individual thing. It's an object, it's a thing. Maybe not an object of experience, but maybe a thing in itself, but it's a thing that is determined wholly through the idea itself. Now, Kant illuminates this by telling us about Plato and Plato's ideas. And Plato's ideas are what Kant is going to call ideals, right? Because Plato's ideas are indeed individual things, right? They are supposed to exist in a sort of special realm of ideas. They're supposed to be like singular entities that, in some sense, cause the entire world. So for Plato, there is at least this sort of supreme idea of the good or the one, and maybe a whole realm of ideas. And of course, this is a conception of the world that sort of flows through philosophy. In Neoplatonism, for instance, in many both Christian and Muslim thinkers, well, all the way up to modernity, this conception of a supreme idea being an entity, and at the same time sort of the idea of the one or the good or God, all of that being basically the same thing, from which everything else emanates, right? Which is the ground of being of everything else. And that is a picture that, according to Kant, has a certain plausibility, but of course, also according to Kant, things go very, very wrong when we claim that we have theoretical knowledge about the existence of such an idea. And that is what this section of the dialectic is going to be about. Kant is going to try to explain how reason comes up with this ideal, with this highest entity, but then he's going to tell us that we cannot possibly prove its existence. Right? We can't even really prove its possibility, its real possibility. So Kant gives us some further examples here in section 1. So he says, for instance, that virtue and wisdom are ideas, but the sage of the Stoics is an ideal. Right? The Stoics, this ancient school of philosophy, had the idea of the perfect sage, right? A human being who would be perfectly wise and right about everything. And for Kant, that is the embodiment of an idea, the idea of wisdom, perfect wisdom, in an individual entity, in this sage. And, that might not be like it doesn't exist anywhere in actuality, but it's still relevant, right? It's an ideal also in our, not Kant's, but our, yours and mine, sense of the word, an ideal in the sense of something we can try to live up to. Okay, so that is section 1. And then in section 2, Kant is going to take this notion of an ideal, like the ideal sage, but now in its transcendental sense, like looking at its role in transcendental philosophy. And Kant starts by making a very intriguing suggestion. The suggestion that there is a kind of synthetic principle that we haven't really thought about yet. And Kant explains this by first making a distinction between concepts and things. So here's what he says at the beginning of section 2. Every concept in regard to what is not contained in it is indeterminate and stands under the principle of determinability, that of every two contradictorily opposed predicates, only one can apply to it, which rests on the principle of contradiction and hence is a merely logical principle. So what is Kant talking about? Well, let's take a concept. Let's take the concept of cow. Okay. Some things are contained in it, right? A cow is an animal, is a mammal, is maybe it's contained in the concept of cow that it can give milk under good circumstances, or that it likes to eat plants, that kind of stuff. But clearly there's also a lot that is not contained under the concept of cow, but that is left open by it, and where we can have contradictorily opposed predicates, either one can apply to it. So if I have a cow, it could be green or not green. If I have a cow, it could be owned by me or not owned by me. If I have a cow, it could be healthy or not healthy. If I have a cow, it could be, in the Netherlands or not in the Netherlands, and so on and so forth, right? All these predicates can be applied to a cow. And of course, we know in advance that for every predicate that is left open by the concept itself, it is possible for these two opposed predicates to apply to it, but also only one of them can apply to it, right? A cow can't be both healthy and not healthy. In the same sense, a cow can't be both green and not green, and so on and so forth. This, Kant says, is a merely logical principle. Okay, fine. I think we can agree with that. Everything, so now we're not talking about concepts, now we're talking about things, however, as to its possibility, further stands under the principle of thoroughgoing determination, according to which, among all possible predicates of things, insofar as they are compared with their opposites, one must apply to it. This does not rest merely on the principle of contradiction, for besides considering everything in relation to two contradictorily conflicting predicates, it considers everything further in relation to the whole of possibility. Okay. So what is Kant telling us here? Well, one thing he's telling us is that for these like contradictory predicates, um, one of them has to apply to the cow. It has to be either green or not green. It has to be either owned by me or not owned by me, and so on and so forth. But maybe that is still a merely logical principle. Right? A little bit later on, Kant is going to mention the principle of excluded middle, which is basically the principle that if I have A and not A, then either of these two must be true. So either it's true that the cow is green, or it's true that not the cow is green. So this might still be a logical principle, but there's something else going on here, right? What we are thinking when we think this principle of thoroughgoing determination is not just that given some pair of opposed predicates, one of them has to apply to the cow, or whatever thing it is we are considering. We're not thinking just that, oh, if you're given a pair of predicates, one of them has to apply. We are thinking the sort of completely general thought which relates essentially to the idea of a sort of complete whole of possibility, that for every pair of possible predicates, one of them has to apply to the object and the other not. Right? So when I think of a thing, and when I think that a thing is thoroughly determined, right, that there's nothing non-determined, nothing ambiguous or ambivalent about things in the world, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing is I'm relating them in thought to the whole of possibility, to all the possible pairs of predicates. And I am claiming that for every possibility, it has been determined what applies and what doesn't apply to the thing. Okay, now I guess that the real story has to be a little bit more complicated, and Kant knows that it has to be a little bit more complicated, because at a certain point he's going to tell us that, for instance, when we come to the most real being, which we will come to in a moment, we don't think that empirical predicates are applying to it. Well, actually, no. I guess that is fine. So here's the worry I was trying to express. The worry I was trying to express is that some predicates don't seem to apply to cows. Right? Cows aren't even or odd. Okay, they're not even or odd. But of course, what Kant is thinking of is even and not even. And cows are not even, right? And they're not odd either. So I don't think, I was trying to phrase a worry, but I don't think it's a real worry. If you were having the same worry, hey, there's no real worry. We know that cows are determined in being not even and not odd and not square, and all those things that only apply to numbers. So, what we have here is the thought of a completed whole. Right? Just as in, let's say, the antinomies, we had the thought of the completed world, or the completed chain of causes. Here we have the thought of the completed realm of all possibility. Right? As Kant expresses it, the whole of possibility as the sum total of all predicates of things in general. And by presupposing that as a condition a priori, it represents everything as deriving its own possibility from the share it has in that whole of possibility. Right, so what Kant is telling us here is that we think of things as completely determined, and by that we relate them in thought a priori to this whole of possibility, and we think of the thing itself as being possible because it relates to this whole of possibility. It is in relating to this whole of possibility that we can say, a cow is possible because it's these determinations of the whole of possibility. And it's also, I guess, in virtue of its relation to this whole of possibility, that we can judge things like, well, it's possible for this cow to be ill, it's possible for this cow to be purple, and so on and so forth. So, in order to cognize, this is A573, in order to cognize a thing completely, one has to cognize everything possible and determine the thing through it, whether affirmatively or negatively. Thoroughgoing determination is consequently a concept that we can never exhibit in concreto in its totality, and thus it is grounded on an idea which has its seat solely in reason, which prescribes to the understanding the rule of its complete use. So, we are here, we have an idea, this totality that we can never find in actual experience can't be a concept of the understanding, it must be an idea of reason, as we have learned before when Kant told us what an idea is. Now Kant is going to go on and tell us that it is also an ideal. So, although this idea of the sum total of all possibility, insofar as it grounds everything as the condition of its thoroughgoing determination in regard to the predicates which may constitute the thing, is itself still indeterminate, and through it we think nothing beyond a sum total of all possible predicates in general, we nevertheless find on closer investigation that this idea, as an original concept, excludes a multiplicity of predicates, which, as derived through others, are already given, or cannot coexist with one another, and that it refines itself to a concept thoroughly determined a priori, and thereby becomes the concept of an individual object that is thoroughly determined merely through the idea, and then must be called an ideal of pure reason. And so what Kant is going to argue is that that there are sort of positive concepts and negative concepts, if you wish, right? And so positive concepts are the concepts that have that sort of posit some kind of being, and negative concepts are the concepts of negation or limitation of that being. And so when we think of this sum total of possibility, Kant suggests, it sort of naturally leads us to the thought of a thing that has only all of these positive predicates, that doesn't have any limitations, that is sort of the most real of all beings. And that would be a thing that is determined through the idea alone, and therefore it would be an ideal. And because this idea is a transcendental idea, what we end up with is a transcendental ideal. The ideal that is the highest being, the most real being. So Kant gives us at A574 a distinction between two types of negation, logical negation and transcendental negation, that I think would repay close study to anyone interested in, say, the conflict between Carnap and Heidegger about not and nothing, where, you know, these are sort of Kantian resources that are going to really fit well into a Heideggerian way of thinking. At A575, A576, we get this idea of the all of reality, the ideal, the single being in which is the most real thing, the ens realissimum, and so on and so forth. So what we have here, Kant says, is the one single genuine ideal of which human reason is capable, because only in this one single case is an in itself universal concept of one thing thoroughly determined through itself and cognized as the representation of an individual. Right, so here only we have a concept that sort of, through reason itself, right now abstracting away from everything that is given in experience, unlike with the cosmological ideas, and thinking merely about what we think when we think a thing. Well, we think a limitation of the sum total of all possibility, and so there is this one ideal, the most real thing from which all possibility flows as limitation, as it were. That is the one single ideal which human reason is capable of. Now, of course, Kant doesn't believe that this means that we believe or have to believe that such a thing exists, such a most real being. So around the beginning of A578, Kant says that it is self-evident that with this aim, namely solely that of representing the necessary thoroughgoing determination of things, reason does not presuppose the existence of a being conforming to the ideal, but only the idea of such a being, in order to derive from an unconditioned totality of thoroughgoing determination the conditioned totality, that is that of the limited. We need this ID, this ideal in thought. We don't need to claim that something like it exists. Now, one thing that we probably should stress at this point is that the idea of this most real entity is not quite the idea of a God, right? It doesn't have all the properties that God is supposed to have, right? And so Kant is going to have to tell us something more about how we get to the concept of God. Well, here's what he's going to do. He's going to tell us that the object of reason's ideal, this is around the start of A579, the object of reason's ideal, which is to be found only in reason, is also called the original being. Because it is nothing above itself, it is called the highest being, and because everything else as conditioned stands under it, it is called the being of all beings. So now we are sort of getting more and more phrases that remind us of the traditional concept of a God. The original being, highest being, being of all beings. But again, all of this does not signify the objective relation of an actual object to other things, but only that of an idea to concepts. And as to the existence of a being of such preeminent excellence, it leaves us in complete ignorance. Kant clarifies at the bottom of A579 that this being is not going to have all the positive concepts in the sense that every non-negated concept is going to apply to it, right? I mean, if we have a pair like green and not green, should we say that, you know, the highest being is green? That would be kind of weird, right? Especially if this highest being is supposed to be, in the end, an immaterial God or something like that. And what's more, it would seem to lead us into grave logical problems when we also have to say that this highest being is purple and red and blue and so on. So in order, I think, to sort of forestall objections like that, at the bottom of A579, Kant tells us this. He says, rather the highest reality would ground the possibility of all things as a ground, and not as a sum total. And the manifoldness of the former rests not on the limitations of the original being itself, but on its complete consequences, to which our whole sensibility, including all reality and appearance, would then belong, which cannot belong to the idea of a highest being as an ingredient. Right? So God is not temporal and spatial and colored and all the other things that we are going to find in sensibility. But somehow we have to think of these predicates in a very abstract way, I suppose, as emanating, as coming from, as being consequences of this one being. And again, Kant is here sort of reiterating a way of thinking that has been very, very influential in the philosophical tradition, especially in Neoplatonism and all the philosophies that have been inspired by Neoplatonism, which is a very, very large part of the Western tradition indeed. Now, 580. If we pursue this idea of ours so far as to hypostasize it, so as to posit this being, then we will be able to determine the original being through the mere concept of the highest reality as a being that is singular, simple, all-sufficient, eternal, etc. In a word, we will be able to determine it in its unconditioned completeness through all predications. The concept of such a being is that of God, thought in a transcendental sense. And thus the ideal of pure reason is the object of a transcendental theology. Meanwhile, this use of the transcendental idea would already be overstepping the boundaries of its vocation and its permissibility. So, what is Kant going to do in the rest of the ideal? Well, what he is definitely going to do is he is going to explain this. The overstepping of the boundaries of its vocation and its permissibility. Kant is going to explain to us how we cannot know, that we cannot know, and why we cannot know that there is a real entity corresponding to the ideal. Right? We cannot know that there actually is a highest being, that there actually is a God, at least not on theoretical grounds. And so In section 3, Kant will explain to us, how speculative reason tries to infer to the existence of a highest being. And then in sections 4, 5, and 6, he is going to go through what he claims are the 3 possible arguments for the existence of God. The ontological argument, which proves God from concepts alone, the cosmological argument, which proves the existence of God from the existence of something, doesn't matter what, and finally the physico-theological proof, which proves God from the perfect order and harmony and complexity of the world. So that is what we will be looking at in our next video.